We now return to Illinois Rising, presented by the Illinois Opportunity Project, the radio show discussing honest truth about Illinois policy and politics. Here's AM 560's Dan Proft.
Dan and Pat back on this edition of Rising. And Pat, here we go again, talking about tax increases and more money for schools. Tony Smith, who is Governor Rauner's schools chief, this is remarkable, proposed last week at a meeting in Chicago a $1,500 per household tax increase. $1,500 per household tax increase, 6 months after a 32% income tax increase, while his boss, the governor, is saying he's going to unwind the tax increase he vetoed over several years, like by the end of his second term if he were to win one. So it was a bad thing, the tax increase last July. That's why he vetoed it. But it wasn't such a bad thing that he wants to repeal it straight away, which leads one to question whether or not he didn't want the tax increase in the first place, because now he's talking about prospectively repealing it over time. At the same time, his schools chief is proposing an immediate $1,500 per household tax increase. Well, I guess for the next legislative session that's begun. And this is to fund schools and the new evidence-based model that the luminaries in Springfield came up with the governor's assent. And just by way of context and institutional knowledge, Prairie State Wire, which is one of my publications, looked at state spending, total state spending, between 1998 and 2016 on K-12 education. Total spending in Illinois on K-12 education during that 18-year period increased 5%. Total enrollment increased 5%. Correct. Total enrollment increased 5% during that 18-year period. Total taxpayer spending on K-12 in Illinois, 111%. 22x. 22x over 18 years spending versus enrollment. Are we getting 22% better student outcomes? Not according to test scores or graduation rates or other measures of aptitude with respect to preparedness for post-secondary education or the workforce.
We are getting higher teacher salary, administrator salaries, and pensions. We're getting that. Is that good? Is there
it's
anything
good for
there?
them.
Yeah, it's good for them.
And apparently Governor Rauner and the schools chief wants to continue to make it better for them at the expense of everyone else. For more on this topic, we're pleased to be joined by Ted Dabrowski, who is the president of WirePoints, wirepoints.com. Ted, thanks for joining us. Appreciate it.
Thank you guys for having me.
So what about this $1,500 for every household in the state so we can pump another $7 billion into K-12 education?
You just got to wonder where this guy's coming from and where the State Board of Education is coming from. This new law that was passed last year, it's flawed on so many respects, and yet I think they proved how true this bad deal is by rather than asking for the money over the next decade, which is what they promised, and now they're asking for all the money in 1 year, $7 billion in additional money. That's a $1,500 tax increase, as you mentioned, just for this, right? We know that the state government wants to spend a lot more on many other things. So imagine what the total tax bill will look like. But it just shows how disconnected Tony Smith is from and the state board from average Illinoisans and from his own governor, who says he wants to cut taxes. It's a joke, frankly.
Ted, is he disconnected from his own governor? I mean, obviously there's one of two things that's happening here. Either the governor is complicit with this from a policy perspective, right, because he wants to, garner votes or support somewhere, and so he's allowing Smith to go out and do this. Or he's just completely incompetent and has no control over the people that he's hired and no control over his government. Either one is bad for the governor, but I'm not sure which one that it is.
Well, no, and I think you're right. In the end, Governor Rauner signed this bill. He shouldn't be surprised by the fact that there's massive demands of new money for education. In fact, Rauner supported more and more spending on this, despite the fact that many times he said that the state is corrupt and not transparent. So he's tried to reform other things, but for some reason in education, he's happy to dole out more and more money. and maybe that's why Tony Smith was emboldened to ask for $7 billion more. I think from everything we've seen about this plan, not only has it failed, it's failed in every state it's been tried. It has nothing to do about outcomes and improving outcomes for kids. It's all about putting more money in. It'll end up just costing taxpayers more. It'll cost more in pensions, but it has nothing to do with outcomes. And so don't be surprised if we spend billions more, and the results in most of these schools will be pretty much where they were before they started.
Right, and you're referencing some of the work that's been done by Eric Hanishek, among others, who's a fellow at the Hoover Institute at Stanford University, and has done some of the analyses on evidence-based model implementation in other states, and essentially draws the conclusions you just described.
Well, let me say something that I think is pretty phenomenal. Illinois already spends more than any other state in the Midwest. And listen to this. We spend 20% more than Michigan on education per student. We spend 42% more than Indiana. We far outspend our neighbors. So, we should be talking about how do we make education better with the money we have, given that we already spend a lot. How do we improve outcomes? And instead, what we've got is saying, let's spend more on this evidence-based, which I put it in quotes, air quotes. It doesn't work. All it does is it calls for more money. And it's just crazy to think that we would spend $7 billion more when we already spend more than everybody else.
One of the other things I saw you remark upon, too, is that, we covered it in my outlet, prairiestatewire.com, but the proposal by Tony Smith for a $1,500 per household tax increase did not get a lot of Chicago or Springfield press corps coverage.
Oh, they ignored it. I think I said somewhere, if he'd called for $1 billion cut in spending, there would have been outrage. Every newspaper would have covered it. But when he adds $7 billion in spending, which means that massive tax hike, right? It's $1,500 per household in taxes. It's actually $3,500 more per kid in Illinois for education. I guess I'd call it just irresponsible, reckless, because the state can't afford it. We're already losing people, right? We've shrunk 4 years in a row. We have the highest property tax bills already in the nation, and one of the highest combined state and local tax bills. What the heck, what are we thinking, that people are just going to pay this and everything is fine? For the media to ignore that, I think it's just irresponsible.
Well, and isn't the
of course, your paper?
Yes, and isn't the implication that the $1,500 per household tax increase, the implication to that is everything the same, and now layer on another $1,500. So it's not like there's a proposal to kind of completely rethink how we're funding K-12 education to provide people some property tax relief who are having their homes liquidated by local units of government through property taxation. This essentially starting from where we are now and just adding $1,500 per household.
Yeah, So here's the problem, and here's what he ignores, and here's what the educational elite and the political elite ignore. We have a massively bloated school system, right? We have 860 school districts. The pay for most of those superintendents, most of them, not all of them, they're all six-figure. And when you get to the North Shore, you're paying all these bureaucrats $300,000, $400,000 salaries, which means they'll get $7 to $10 million pensions. We can't afford that. We've got these school districts that have 150 kids in them. How can we afford to have all this bureaucracy for such a small group of students? So there's mergers to be done. We got to cut this executive pay. We've got to consolidate all this stuff. That's what we need to be doing. That's how we take care of the taxpayer.
So, Ted, the issue, and I talk about this all the time in my public life, is the parent, right? So how do you convince the parent that if we spend less money, that their kids' educational opportunities won't be impacted? Because that's the sale job that the bureaucrats are doing on the parents. Do you tell them what's happening in Indiana and Michigan for 20 or 30% less? They have to buy into the idea that if money isn't increased, or if it's in fact decreased, which is what I think should happen, that their kids' education isn't going to suffer. I know it's not going to, but they don't necessarily believe that. How do you bridge that gap?
No, and this is a big problem. I spent in my Wilmette school district. I went for a few hours and then actually spoke up. We've got to counter the facts. Right now, it's easy for the unions and for the education bureaucracy to spread the fear that, oh my gosh, if we cut, we're gonna it's gonna hurt your kids and hurt your house values. We've got to change all that, and a lot of that just has to do with the education. We've got to show them that we're spending a lot more than everybody else. We have to show them that all the money's not making it to the classroom and to your favorite teacher. It's going to all these bureaucrats sitting in district offices. We have to change that whole mentality, and that's the hard work we have to do on our side.
He is Ted Dabrowski, the president of WirePoints, wirepoints.com. Ted, thanks as always for joining us. Appreciate it.
Thank you, guys.